Hello. The reason I'm creating this video is because recently I started working on a personal project making dynamic interface for max-msp because I need some custom things built for performance I'm doing, and I faced some problems. Namely, you can't automate the created dials, and also saving the presets is a little bit more complicated when you're creating things dynamically. And because of this, I went online and I asked in a couple places, and Federico was one of the people who replied to my question, and he was so kind and amazing, and created a video about dynamic UI in Max. If you don't know Federico's work, he's on amazing Max stuff. You probably know him. He's a super cool guy, and his channel is really amazing. I really recommend you to subscribe. And when I was watching his video, I saw that he said about creating classes in JavaScript, and I saw some other things on his code that I thought could be improved. And I thought the best I could do would be to do a video and retribute somehow some of this knowledge that he and other people share in the community, and hopefully this video will be helpful for Federico and for other people. So some of the things I would like to address, one of the first things is Federico says let's create a class. He says let's create a class, and then he goes and creates the modularity function. But the reality is, like, classes don't really exist in JavaScript. Classes is the keyword class is just got introduced to JavaScript recently, and I'm not exactly sure how is it today, but in reality the classes in JavaScript were always just a hacked thing with prototypes. And even if you go to W3 schools best practice, they will say don't use new objects, because really I think the your life is going to be way easier if you can avoid writing code thinking in this way. So going to Federico's code, we can see he's using this a lot of times, and also using new here, and I think this can be avoided, and will make the code a lot nicer. um, there are some other things that can be addressed on this code that we could talk as well. Like, for instance, he has this array here which he pushes into, and then does a plus plus in a counter to account for the number of multi sliders. But in reality, this could be is out every time you push into an array, the length of the array will automatically keep count of the amount of items here. But anyway, I'll publish some codes later where all these things are addressed. I think the most important thing to address though is using this, because this is kind of just takes a lot of headspace and even space on your codes if you keep thinking this way. The reality is that a lot of times, I mean, realistically, you don't really ever need this keywords, but we're gonna get there. I can see, for instance, here Federico uses this bind function because he creates a callback to this function, and he wants to change this variable called values. And because he created these dot values here, he ends up having to do a bind here and then write these dot values here again. This is a classic example of like how using this will keep making your life more difficult. In reality, if you just write var values equals an array, then here you really just have to do values equal array, and then you don't even need to do a bind dot this, because basically in JavaScript, when you create a function, if you declare a variable like this, for instance values, this variable will be inherited in all the code that's written in this function. So for instance, if you write values here, values will be accessible inside of this function, will be accessible inside of this function, will be accessible inside of this function, will be accessible pretty much everywhere, because it's in the same, they are all declared on the same scope. So for instance, by creating these values here, we can already remove the this in here. I saw another thing, for instance, here I can see that on the multi-slider, Federico is passing this.patcher as a parameter. And I think the reason he told me he's giving this.patcher here is because if he goes and write this.patcher here inside of this object, it will be undefined. And as far as I know, the reason why it's undefined is because, one, he uses the new thing. If you just call a function like this, it will work on the first level of the function. I even did a test here, which I will leave on my example patch. And but anyway, the truth about the patcher is that you don't really need to add this.patcher, because this.patcher, the patcher is part of the global variables in Max. So if you go to Max and you check, it will say here global methods, and I think global variables too. Yeah, patcher, access to the patcher. So the patcher and inlet function and outlet function and so many other functions like post, they're all global in JavaScript and Max. So here, if you write this.patcher to pass as a parameter, you passing a parameter, you passing a reference to a global property of the global scope. And then basically you getting this p here, and then you creating a reference for this p here, and this.patcher, this all starts to get very confusing. The reality is patcher, this.patcher works here because patcher is a global, and here you are on the global scope. But the truth is patcher is a global variable. So actually everywhere that you have this.p, you can actually just change, doesn't matter where you are, to patcher. And and basically, so this will make, oh, that's a very nice trick. If you are using VS Code, you can press F2 and rename the variable, and it will rename the variable everywhere. So basically everywhere that you have this.patcher, you can just switch it to patcher, and because patcher is a global variable, it will work. So basically, because we not using this.p, we can stop passing this.patcher as a parameter to multi-slider, and then pretty much everywhere we write this.patcher, I don't think we're writing it anywhere anymore, we can remove. So for instance, this way we are getting rid of the this.patcher. So another thing here that we can address, so we can also remove this line. Another thing here that we can address is, for instance, the parameter pos for position. Once you receive the pos parameter, we are saving a this.pos, and then we doing this.pos equals pos. But in reality, you don't need the this.pos, because pos is a variable, and this variable will be available on every function here. So what I think is that we could just delete this pos, or we could just create a variable here called pos, and then everywhere, instead of pos, this.pos, 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 we can change just to pos. This will create a problem, for instance, here on setRect, where we have a parameter called pause and we have a local variable here called pause. So to avoid this sort of problems, you can just do things like this, new pause. So then you can have a pause equal a new position. I think this is of course like not the most beautiful thing, but I do believe it's definitely better than having this um, everywhere. And the reason we need to do this is because, of course, if you have a variable called pause here and the pause comes as argument, there'll be a clash on the scope here, because basically we have inheriting this variable pause into this function scope, and we're receiving an argument called pause in this function scope, and this creates this sort of conflict. So because the function is setting a new position, I would say just rename the parameter to new pause, and your problem will go away. So what else could be done here? Let me think about one thing I think that I noticed as well on this code is that there is a lot of naming conventions being used. For instance, on the file, Federico uses interface underscore creator with capital. Here it's a Pascal case, so capital no underscore, and then for variables is this weird um, weird non-standard that only cycling uses, as far as I know. Cycling have those functions that get value off and set value off, that doesn't use underscore between the names, and also doesn't use camel case for the functions. But to be honest, I never saw anybody doing this, so I would suggest not doing this for the variable names, and also not really mixing um, casing. So for instance, down the line we use a function lowercase underscore lowercase, and here we're creating a function which is camel case. So I think this gets a little bit confusing, and it's not nice to have standards, not have standards. For instance, this max object listener is max with capital and then object with lower and then listener with capital. I think this is really confusing. So I would advocate to using functions, either snake case like this, or what I used to love snake case for everything, and use snake case for everything. But to be honest, JavaScript nowadays is really going on the TypeScript direction, and the JavaScript API as well is pretty much camel case everywhere. So if you're writing JavaScript and you're working in teams and you're reading JavaScript online from other projects, things will generally be camel case. The only Pascal case things that happen is when you're having a function that you think is pretty unique, or a function that looks like a class constructor. So I would say generally having a function with this case is kind of okay if you think this is a class. But pretty much everywhere you really want to be using camel case, like every JavaScript API, the native API from JavaScript, and most people do. And for instance, here number of sliders is using camel case. So here, for instance, this is not using camel case; it's using Pascal case. So I would not mix this. I would try to keep this as a standard as possible, same everywhere. And here as well, another thing I notice is like some of the code goes over the 80 characters line, and I would say this is generally not very nice, because in smaller screens and other places, when you have like two files at the same time, which becomes very common, You see, like having 8 characters limitation is kind of, this is not even a small screen. This is 1920, and a lot of times you need to copy code from one file to the other or compare files. So having files that go over the 80 characters line is generally not a very good idea. I would suggest not doing this. Um, in general, I think that's basically the biggest things I would do. I would definitely move the variables as much as possible to the beginning of the file. I think this is it's a pretty general thing to do. And as I said, for the multi-array slider, we can use the length of the array to keep count of the items here instead of having this. And yeah, just to give some other examples, for instance, if you would use here instead of this dot index, we can just use index, and then instead of this dot index everywhere, we would just go and write index. And for instance, for things like this, as I said, for files, for the 8 characters, you can just break your code, and I think in general it will make things more readable. I think another thing is like when you not using the new function, I think one of the biggest the new keywords, one of the biggest things I think people would ask is like, okay, so if you don't use the this, if you don't use the this, then how would you be able to call the functions later? And I'll give an example here. This is actually really cool. So the idea here is, let's say you're creating a multi-slider, right? So let's say at the end of the function, you want to return basically the functions that you want to make available for the external world. So let's say you want this function destroy to be available to the external words. You can literally just write function destroy and put your code in here, and then here you can just return an object with the things you want to have available for the external world. For instance, this function destroy, and it will be available for the external world. These are the functions. For instance, let's say if you do the same with load from dict, right? So you do load from dict here, you do save to dict here, you do set rect here. Let's say you do all those things, because it's not a class anymore, and because you're not using the this anymore, those functions, they will not be available to the external world. So this is pretty cool actually, because basically this allow you to have functions in certain scopes that are private functions, which is something that is actually really hard to create in JavaScript, because classes really don't exist. Maybe on new JavaScript versions and TypeScript and things, you can actually create like private functions, but in this world of max-msp JavaScript, I think that's one of the only ways. So for instance, if you want the save to dict to be available to the external world, you just get the save to dict, come here and do save to dict, and then basically now you just go everywhere that you call save to dict, and you can do save to dict this way, and then the same for everything that you want to make available, like the load from dict. Load from dict, you would come here and do return load from dict, and let me rename this, and then boom, then now this load from dict is available everywhere. Um, Also, another thing is like you can always do this function here on VS Code called format document, which will format the document for you and make it more standardized, like create spaces after the semicolons and things. I think you can configure it to do the curly braces in the next line. You can also configure it to break for you after the 80 character ruler. I'm sure there's loads of tutorials about how to do those things. Um, I think basically that's most of the things I wanted to say. For instance, you could keep taking out the variables here. So this dot nos, you really don't need to create this. You can just use it here, right? Boom, and so on and so forth. For instance, index here. I think you are using the when you call the move slider function. Dun, 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 dun. You doing g number of multi sliders, but then again you could just use the length, so you don't really need to pass this. Also, you don't need to pass the patcher, right? Because the patcher is a global variable, so straight away your constructor got a lot simpler. You don't need the index here. Let's say your index could be var index equals g multi slider dot length, and here pause. As I said, you don't need to create, and there's loads of yeah, the code starts to become nice. So for instance, here on loads from dict, when I call set rect, you don't need the this anymore because set rect is declared in the same scope as load from dict, so you could create that. So this dot values, we don't need it as well. Then here on values, you could just do the same, like new values, and it would be here, or you could say stored values in order to make the things and the variable names more standard. I actually recommend always writing down the whole variable like position instead of pause, because when other people read the code, position or like the other things that we were doing here where we did this dot nos equal number of sliders, I think in the long term, and if you start writing a lot, these things will end up catching up and making things less readable and less understandable. I think the ideal situation is everything we do will look as much as possible. We look at like English instead of like abbreviations and stuff. This helps the code be more maintainable. Um, yeah, I think uh, I think that's kind of like the big the bulk of things that could be improved. And I will now go and change to the code that I actually wrote based on this interface creator to do basically the same thing, but it's more like the way I would do the code instead of just refactoring this. So basically what I have here is I have a global variable called state, and my idea here for this variable is to store the states that we're gonna send to the pattern storage. And here I also have a variable called settings, where I save things like offset of the UI and the default dimensions of the objects. I saw, Federico, you were having something like this size equals 200 and 600, where this is the width and the height of the default width and height of the object. And I think this could be promoted to the global scope and help us configure this script easier. So that's the first things I did was to promote this. Then because of all the simplification, my function multi slider became a just create multi slider. So if you look here, you had a function create multi slider that actually calls the multi slider and then increases the index. But basically I just end up merging everything together into one create multi slider function that receives the number of sliders. And here I'm using another trick, which is to check if the number of sliders parameter was used. So if you call this function with number of sliders, it will use the number you used as an argument. But if not, then the default number of sliders will be 10. On new versions of JavaScript, you can do this very easily by doing just this, numbers of sliders equals 10, and then the default parameter will be 10. But again, this is not reality yet on max-msp JS objects. Then another, I think it would be great if Cycling 74 updated the JS version, or Maybe if we could have access to all those Max APIs on Node.js object, which I don't think we can yet, but hopefully in the future we will be able to. So the next thing I did here is I made sure that the numbers of sliders cannot be negative. So in case the user passes -1, -2, -3, this math.max function from JavaScript will make sure that is actually going to create just one slider. Then the index of variable I will actually get from the mood sliders array length. I end up making sliders as a camel case as well, so we don't have like two words without spacing or without case differentiation. Then I create a name variable, which is basically mood slider plus index. I create a max object with a new default. I set the name. I decided to send it to presentation, and then I set the size of it to the number of sliders. Then here I create a listener that we use to save the values of the multi slider into the state of basically the state of our script. And then I noticed sometimes there was an error on the console from Max, where if you change into presets that have lesser number of mood sliders, we were getting some errors. So basically, I have to do this if condition here. If you didn't watch Federico's video, basically what we built was JavaScript that allows you to save presets. So you can do something like this and store on one preset, and then you can remove all the mood sliders and create another one and store on two, and then you can switch between those parameters. So basically here we are saving into this state object uh, the values of that mood slider. So after doing this, I created a function setRect. I renamed it to update position. I think it makes more sense for me. So then I set the position of the mood slider on the presentation rect and on the patching rect, so on the presentation and not on the presentation. Then the function here called you had a function called save to dict, and I thought a better idea here would be to have a function called get value off, which is similar to the get value off from Max, but instead I'm just using camel case to keep it consistent with JavaScript standards. And this get value off basically returns the things that I would like to save from this mood slider. So in this case, the position, which I'm getting from the presentation rect, and the values of the mood sliders. And then load from dict, it receives the state from the dictionary and updates the position. And then if from the preset, and receives the state from the preset and updates the position. If the states from the presets have values, I also change the size of the mood slider to have the amount of steps we want by using those functions here. Then the destroy function, again, we just do patcher.remove. We don't need the this.patcher as explained. Here I create a little object called multi-slider. So if you're coming from a class word, this is kind of like my idea of the object that is yielded by this function. So this function yields this object, which is not really an instance of a class, it's more like an object which with a public API of things, and I push this into the mood sliders array from our state. So basically this pushes into our state, it increases the length of the array, so that's the index, etc. And then here on the position, I call an update position function. So we actually set the position of the objects. For instance, here I saw we have something where we create the object, and we also have a function to update the object. When we create the position, you set the position of the mood slider, and then you have also a function that does the same thing. So this is basically repeating code. So instead, I just create this update position function, and then we can use it ourselves inside of this function, and also from outside one day if we need to. Actually, I publish a set rect, but it could be actually well, doesn't matter. Don't wanna go. Actually, it's not used anywhere. I didn't even need to publish this. Anyway, to not get sidetracked here. So another thing I used is the settings offset plus the dimensions of our width configuration plus 10 to be seen as margin times the index. Then again, the index here is the mood slider length. So the first object we create, it will have index 0, the second one will have index 1, so this way we'll keep pushing the objects there. As an extra to Federico's tutorial, I added this function called update marks for live width, which I think is pretty nice. So basically, by having this object here called live.thisDevice with the name live.thisDevice, I can just call it here get named live.thisDevice, and then by calling this function set width, I can change the width of the max for live device. This is pretty cool. So as you keep creating objects, it keeps changing the width of the max for live device. So this wasn't on Federico's tutorials, but I really wanted to have this function working and this thing working, and I thought it was pretty cool. So I'm adding to this video as well. So you can change between a really large array of things or just two, and live will automatically push things for you, which is really nice, really neat. And then so just to continue on my codes, I do the remove sliders function just like Federico, and then I do destroy, set the mood sliders array to empty on the state. Then I update the live width if we do that. On the function get value of, which is one of the functions Federico explains, I'm doing the basically the same as Federico. I go through all the mood sliders, but from this state variable. Then I push into this JSON variable that I have here, and then I create a dictionary and set into the state in one go. I think, let me look what Federico was doing. He was doing replace on number of sliders and saving to dict on everything. Anyway, it's pretty much the same. Then the set value of, which is the function that max-msp calls with a dictionary object with the presets when we select the presets. That's also the same as Federico, and of course update the max for live width. By the way, if anybody knows how to do this set width directly from JavaScript, just by instanciate the max for live class on JavaScript, please let me know in the comments somewhere. The only way I did this so far is by having that live this device. Maybe this is actually not necessary. I think it's probably not necessary, to be honest. Probably there is a var max, there is something like new max for live function. I don't really remember what is the way of doing this on max. Actually, I will leave some links down on this video with some useful stuff. This is a very nice useful JS live API tutorials that somebody posted recently on the forum. So, well, that I found recently. This was not posted recently, but it's some really nice tutorials about Max for Live. I'll leave down links for this, so you can read a little bit more about Max for Live. This is pretty useful. I will also leave a link to this These slides that I created about max-msp and JavaScript for a workshop I did in 2014 in a max-msp convention here in England. Basically, you can go through the slides by pressing arrow down on your keyboard, or you can see all the slides by pressing ESC, and then you can just go to the slides. You can press go to the right side to change the column, or left to go to the left. But basically, yeah, there is some very basic JavaScript and max-msp knowledge here in case you're really new to JavaScript. I will also leave a link to those devices. I had the pleasure of collaborating with Helmut Lobby a long time ago, actually 10 years ago. I was speaking with those guys, and they are really, really talented MIDI controller hackers and musicians, and we did a few devices in which I collaborated with them by write some JavaScript. One device is this called chord splitter, which basically sends when you play a chord, it splits every note of the chord into different tracks. So you can have, let's say, four monosynths playing. Each monosynth with a different preset when you press a chord. There is another one called quantized trigger, which is basically the idea that you could have like a kick drum and a bass playing, and then on your bass you have this quantized trigger, and then you route your kick drum to be a trigger, so the bass notes only play when the kick play, so it's always played together. There is also this other device called minimum note length, which just enforces a minimum note length on every note that you play, and all of those are built in the JavaScript. I will also leave a link to the source code of this script that I did based on Federico code, and this live projects that where I'm using for testing. I put this on GitHub, so you can if you can download it from GitHub here on code, download zip, or if you're familiar with Git, you can just clone this. And yeah, I think it's pretty much this. One more time, I would like to say thank you to Federico. Really amazing what you're doing, all the videos you are creating, all the knowledge that you share with the community. Actually, there's so many nice videos for Max. The community for Max is really, really amazing. Thank you one more time, Federico. Another thing I would like to say is if you, like me, like the idea of creating dynamic UIs, it would be good to send an email to support at cycling74.com and support at ableton.com and ask them to add the context for automation on the parameters that are created dynamically. So for instance, if you have a live dial and you right click, you are able to automate this live dial on Ableton, but for the live dials created dynamically, you cannot automate them. When you right click, nothing happens, and this is yeah, that's not so cool. It would be great if we had a method like this set with on the Max for Live API. We could do live.republish parameters or something like this, so we could create dynamic UIs for real, and have live know about this, just like other plugins like Contact, etc. And also I'm gonna leave some links in case you wanna check out other things I do, like my record label, some records I released, my Soundcloud, my websites, etc. And yeah, if you would like some help with JavaScript, uh, also feel free to get in touch. I'll be happy to help. And yeah, I hope this video was useful. And until next time, bye bye.